All right, guys, welcome. Thank you all for joining us for Sunday School. We had planned to record it on YouTube Live, but we got some technical difficulties. No one will be surprised, but we're going to record it, and this should be on our YouTube channel this morning in the upload section. Thank you all for tuning in, and I'm really excited for our session this morning. I've got Bob with me, you see here. And behind us here, coming to us from Maryland, is Brandt Montgomery. I'm going to let Bob do most of Brandt's introduction, but Brandt is a priest and pastor in the Episcopal Church and a scholar, up-and-coming scholar, and excellent writer. If you're a fan of all the Living Church, a couple other publications, you may have seen some of Brandt's work. He does some really, really good stuff. So we're going to get to hear the fruit of some of his academic and scholarship and personal experience going forward. Brandt and I went to seminary at more or less the same time. Brandt, I don't know if you remember, but I think it was like we'd all been approved to go to seminary, and Bishop Parsley had a party at his house.
Right.
And I think Brad Landry and you and I and a few others,
right,
or a few others were there.
I think Katie Nakamura was there too.
Yeah. So we've kind of come up together in the Episcopal Church in the same cohort, and so I'm grateful for him as a colleague, and as a speaker here for Sunday School. With that being said, I want to turn it over to Bob to do more of an introduction for Brandt.
Well, Brandt and I knew each other from Talladega. Brandt grew up in Talladega when I was rector there at St. Peter's. He attended our Episcopal Day School at St. Peter's. He was friends with my children, and so I think of Brandt like a son, even because he was always with us and with our kids playing. And now he's a colleague and a friend of mine, and I value that greatly. Brandt now is chaplain at St. James School, a very prestigious school in Hagerstown, Maryland, where he also served at an Episcopal school was it All Saints School? All Saints?
No, Ascension.
Church of the Ascension in Lafayette, Louisiana. And he had also been at Canterbury and Tuscaloosa as a curate at the Student Center and the Episcopal Church of Canterbury there. He got his master's at General, as Jeff said, and in New York, where his thesis there was on Times prisoner, the Right Reverend Charles Callcott Jones Carpenter. He was our Bishop of Alabama in the Civil Rights Movement in the Episcopal Diocese of Alabama. He graduated from Montevallo for his undergraduate degree, specializing in trumpet performance. I always enjoyed hearing Brandt play the trumpet. When he was in Talladega, he was always playing, and he played for us at church. He's now working on his doctorate of ministry at the School of Theology at Sewanee, for which he's about to defend his dissertation that is titled The Development of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at St. James School of Maryland. Brandt is a scholar, as Jeff was saying. His interests lie in American religious history, Episcopal Church history, the Oxford movement, and Anglo-Catholicism and the Civil Rights movement. I asked Brandt to share with us today as we were looking for our fall program, and we just wrapped up our summer conversation of race and healing that we participated in, and Gail's going to be teaching a class starting next week on Black theology. And I said, I'd love for Brandt to come share with us some of his thoughts, what he's been working on, but also just his experience as a priest in the Episcopal Church. So Brandt, I'm going to kind of turn it over to you, and Jeff and I will enter into conversation with you as you share, but let you share some about yourself, your experience, and also some of your knowledge.
Well, thank you very much, Bob and Jeff, for having me here virtually. I'm very happy to be here virtually with the people of Holy Trinity Auburn. And just again, thank you so very much. And also to Gail for this invitation for you all. And I just want to say again, Bob introduced the fact that, we have known each other in Talladega. Bob and I go back a long time. Bob, I think you came to Talladega in 1988. Mm-hmm. So we've known each other a long, long time. As I said, I've known his children. And part of my experience, and a lot of the good experience that I've had in the Episcopal Church begins with Bob Blackwell. I have to say that. because it was from Bob in which I began to have and begin to feel the seeds of the vocation to the ordained ministry begin to germinate within me. I remember still to this day Bob giving me a copy of Mike Ramsey's The Christian Priest Today to read as part of my discernment. And so Bob just gives me an opportunity to say thank you for the role that you played in my life, for me beginning to hear God's call in my own life to the priesthood all those years ago. And I really am appreciative to you for all of that. So thank you so very much. And so my experience within the Episcopal Church has, from within the Episcopal Church, has generally been a very positive one. It has been, and this has been one of the things that has really encouraged me to really think about race, a lot of the pushback that I've gotten has been from outside, primarily from fellow African Americans. And in a piece that I had written earlier for the Living Church, I basically said that pushback, if you will, comes unfortunately from a place of history, because there was a time in the Episcopal Church where the theology of the Episcopal Church, where the ideals of the Episcopal Church of it being a very Catholic institution and being open to all, as I said, it was just principle, but it really wasn't lived out. And so African Americans, the majority of them, when they think about the Episcopal Church, they still have that history in mind. And so when I meet other African Americans from other Christian traditions, and especially other African American clergy, and I tell them that I'm an Episcopal priest and everything like that, they always have a lot of questions. And so, and it brings about some good, productive conversation, and some good, insightful conversation from both sides at times. So that has been my experience from that standpoint. But overall, I would say that the Episcopal Church has really enlivened and has really brought into my life the Christian faith and just God's love for me in ways that were in ways that I just cannot describe. And I'm very thankful that God came to my life through the Anglican tradition. And a lot of that had to do with the Episcopal Day School that I went to in Theology. It was there in which I really felt, for the first time, God's love for me. And that is because of the fact that liturgy was doing its work. If you really open to letting the liturgy, and through the liturgy, God come through you and work in your heart and in your life and to form your mind toward Him, then it really can be a very moving experience. And that was what it has been for me, what it still is for me. And so, being an Episcopal school chaplain and educator myself, now this is year 7 in Episcopal school education. And so this is, in a way, I feel, giving back not only to God, but also to the Episcopal Church that really brought me to intentional Christianity through education. And I really believe that Episcopal school education is a very good ministry outlet. And one of the things that I'm very happy to say here is that at St. James School, we have a very diverse student body here. We have not only 15 American states 15 American states represented among our student body, but we also have 16 or 17 international countries represented among the student body. And it has really just brought this sense of us really being a representation of what the world could be. Because of our students, they really love each other, they love hanging out and everything, and they're always hanging on each other when they're walking to the refectory and everything like that. So it really is a good representation of the peaceful kingdom that is to come. But in doing my research about St. James School, I found out that that wasn't always the case. We oftentimes fall into this trap of thinking that because something is one way today, that it has always been that way. I mean, what do you mean it hasn't always? It's obviously that way. It's always been that way. But St. James School even wasn't always that way. And that is because of the fact the Oxford movement, which was the movement back in the mid-19th century that sought to bring back a sense of Catholic theology and practice within Anglicanism, it wasn't an inclusive movement. It was founded on the principles of, again, bringing Anglican a sense of Catholic theology and practice back into Anglicanism, but it sought to do so by way of keeping out Roman Catholics, keeping out Methodists, keeping out Presbyterians, keeping out all dissenters of the established Church of England. And so it was founded on non-inclusive principles. And so with St. James School being founded on the Oxford movement principles back here in 1842 in Maryland, that became ingrained in the school culture. And it really wasn't until the 1950s in which St. James School, as the Anglo-Catholic school that it is known for today in a lot of circles in the Episcopal Church, came to be recognized at. We had headmasters here who were pretty blatantly racist, and I talked about that in my dissertation. Specifically, I talked about one headmaster who described when his father was headmaster and there was a wedding of African Americans in the school chapel. He said that one side of the chapel was filled with darkies and the other side was filled with the schoolboys and the school family. And he also described one particular African American employee who died a very tragic death. He said that he was a good Negro, inherently implying that, African Americans generally are just not inherently good people. So those things are all part of history. And I think one of the things now that we are having to deal with, and a lot of institutions are having to deal with, especially with a lot of the racial unrest that's been going on in the country, is how do we as a people effectively deal with the history of our own institutions and the negative history? How do we confront it? How do we deal with it? And how do we say to ourselves and to each other that we're committed to not letting this happen again? So how do we move forward as a people? And in my dissertation work on the development of diversity, equity, and inclusion at St. James, that is what I hope that my dissertation will be, to help St. James answer those questions that it needs to answer in order to be the institution where a lot of people feel that it can be, and where the principles and traditions and ideals of Anglo-Catholicism can still work in this 21st century time, but in a more present way. So those are just some introductory thoughts that I have so far. So I would just like to shut up now and just open it up for questions and just see where the Spirit leads.
Well, I just had some thoughts, Brand, as you were sharing that one is about generational changes. I feel like I know when at St. Peter's, my children are probably much less aware of racism than I was, and your generation that way. But I know generations before me probably were more, even innocently, more so racist. And I remember hearing a story, I don't know if you did this in your master's thesis, about Bishop Carpenter, when he said that blacks could not come to Camp McDowell.
Right, yes, I do remember that.
And Doug, his son, who was a priest in the diocese, said, "No, sir, they will come." And nobody ever stood up to Bishop Carpenter, I don't think. But Doug, Doug did it.
Yes.
And when then Camp McDowell became integrated, I guess this was in the 60s. It could have been in the 50s. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it was in the mid 60s, I heard. And Hoyt Winslow told me that story.
Okay.
Another retired priest in the diocese. I wanted to include that in the thesis, but I just felt I didn't include it in the end because I felt that was too much of a personal story, and I didn't want to offend Doug in any way by including that story. But when I heard that story and how Doug courageously stood up to his father for that, I was like, that must have been a very important moment, but it was also a very painful moment.
But it changed, and but our kids could not imagine going to camp and it not being integrated in some way.
Right, right. And in my generation, I mean, we're at the point now where why is this still even an issue?
Right.
And speaking about generational change, I have two older half brothers and a half sister that are much older than I am. Like versus my oldest half brother, he'll be 61 years old in October. I was a late kid, and so just the generational changes between us and race have been apparent. Because my sister, who graduated Talladega High School in 1985, she said that was the last year that there was a separate front in town between the white kids and black kids. And she always told me, she said, Brandt, you grew up in a generation, you grew up in a time in which you were just not really aware of this stuff. So, and they said that that's good, but at the same time, they always felt that that was something that kind of hid my mind away from the realities of the racial oppression that still goes on in a lot of our world. Mm-hmm. And so we have to be mindful of that.
Brandt, seems really like an interesting move to focus your work on St. James and to focus on it in terms of its inclusive present in the context of its non-inclusive past. Right. And it seems like that's a really good way as a kind of parochial example of the same dynamic that exists in the Episcopal Church at large.
Right.
Could you kind of surely, and that had to be part of why you kind of went there. Could you speak more about how the context of St. James relates to the kind of larger, similar dynamic in the larger church?
Yeah. Well, what my original intent for my dissertation was, as I said, talk about this idyllic feeling of, well, we've always been this way. And of course, Anglo-Catholicism says it's always been, historically more inclusive than a lot of traditions. So my original intent was to talk about, to talk about the history about how this has always been and kind of show the church that this is the way it's been. Well, that changed when a group of the young alumni of St. James, a lot of them of the post-millennial generation, wrote a petition to our headmaster, Father Dunn, in which they said that there were present at St. James microaggressions, there was some blatant racism that had occurred in the past during their time there. And so when I read that petition, it really surprised me. Really did surprise me that they were saying that all of this stuff was happening. And so that gave me the impetus to really research more of the history of St. James and kind of change the shift, if you will, of my dissertation. And when I found out that, what they were saying in the present time was also present in the past, I was like, okay, there are some things here that St. James really does need to wrestle with. So like, for instance, the church school movement of William Augustus Muhlenberg, who's one of the great Episcopal school educators of the mid-19th century, and for whom Episcopal schools, his church school movement, Episcopal schools today descend from that. Again, the ideals of the church school movement of being very inclusive and providing quality education to the church's students, again, that wasn't the ideals of commonality. But it wasn't framed with race in mind. So it wasn't framed with including African Americans or other minorities in that. Bishop Whittingham, who was our bishop founder here at St. James School, Bishop of Maryland from 1840 to 1879. He was a high churchman, and he evangelized African Americans throughout the diocese personally himself. But there were situations in which, like, for instance, there was a call for African American parishes to be fully admitted into the Diocese of Maryland, and he said he would not allow that. He said it was not tradition. So he was not as inclusive as he should have been. And as I said, we've had headmasters in the past who were just blatantly racist. So when I discovered all of this history in St. James's past, and saw that we definitely had some work to do as far as the young alumni said themselves, I was like, okay, this is how we can begin the process of bringing into the present what it is that we say that we are, but in actuality we have not been. And so that is how I approach it. Hopefully I'm answering your question, Jeff. And I actually had a meeting with some of the alumni yesterday, the young alumni on the Alumni Diversity Committee, and they were very appreciative that I had written my dissertation on this topic for St. James, because they said that they don't feel that this is a coincidence. And I'm just very happy that I'm able to make just this small contribution to St. James's life to help it go to where a lot of people already think that it is, but it isn't actually already there.
Do you think, and looking at the school then, does it give you hope for the church and for our country and moving forward? And do you think how important, or can you explain the importance of dealing with the past in order to move forward? Because I hear a lot of people say, oh, why do we have to dig up all of that? That one part, that's not me, that was my grandparents or whatever. How do you see all that time together, and how does it give you a hope for moving ahead?
Well, how I see it all ties in is that certain activities, certain mindsets and everything, they become ingrained in an institution's culture or in a family's culture. And unconsciously, a lot of people don't realize that unconsciously those behaviors are passed down. So we may act out in a way that we may not consciously think is promoting bad behavior, but unconsciously it is, because that's just what we may have known, that's what we may have always seen, but we don't know any better. So that is why it is important to really dig up or to really study the past, be willing to study the past and deal with it and see how those particular attitudes and those particular actions and everything like that have been passed down, to say, okay, here's something, didn't realize it before. Now that we see this, how can we move forward, going forward? So history really is important. And if we're not willing to engage in history, then we're just going to continue down the cycle of repeating the same things over and over and over again. And it's just going to be a very unfortunate, very negative cycle. So the one thing that I'm very thankful that St. James is doing is that they're willing to engage in this historical look through the past and to see in what ways that we can change, that we're taking it seriously. And a lot of the young alumni, they expressed to me yesterday how actually shocked they were that the school actually took their petition seriously. They weren't really expecting anything to happen, but we're actually taking it seriously. They were very surprised, and they were very thankful. And so again, I think the killing of Breonna Taylor, of George Floyd Jr., and Trayvon Martin for all the years, for a lot of people, they were saying, okay, enough is enough. We have got to change. Now is the time to change. We cannot be gradual about this anymore. And that was part of St. James's problem, is that, being Anglo-Catholic and, Oxford and having that kind of that built-in gradual approach to things, the young alumni are saying this is a different time. And you have to take into consideration where this generation is. The post-millennial generation, 48% of them are racially not white. So they are a very, very diverse generation, racially and everything like that. And so because of that, they want to make sure that everybody's rights are respected. And so that's what's saying, the time is now, we can't wait anymore.
Brent, so I think you're leading us in a really fascinating place. And I wonder, do you, can the word inclusion or inclusive, can it almost sort of absolve us of doing perhaps deeper, harder work of repentance and amendment of life? Is it, could you correctly describe your work as sort of going deeper in the place of a desire to be inclusive?
Well, and what I say in the introduction to my dissertation, I make it clear that when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion from a Christian standpoint, we are talking what is God's original plan for the human race. Because, and I make clear to say that race is the human classification of distinctions, between, skin color and ethnic, everything like that. It is a human construct. It is not part of God's original plan. So when you talk about race, that is a human alien construct to God's plan. And so I talk about it from that standpoint. And so when we get to the point of thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion as being how we are all commonly connected to each other, that is a very good beginning. Because the one thing that connects us all together is the fact that we are all human beings. Every single one of us. African American, white, Asian, Korean, whatever, we are human beings. We share that. And I mean, we all, pump blood and everything like that. So there are a lot more things about us that connect us than there are things that divide us. And so when we get our minds with that mindset and think about that, then we can really be in a place and where we can engage and open ourselves up to full repentance and amendment of life. Because the truth of the matter is, when it comes to all of us here on earth and everything like that, there isn't, black or white or, Korean or anything like that. As far as God is concerned, those, as Paul says, those who confess with their lips and believe in their heart that Jesus is Lord, I mean, you're in. I mean, that is the kingdom of God. And when we get to heaven, I believe we're not going to see all those other distinctions. That's just not going to be the way it is in the world. I mean, in the peaceful kingdom. And so, when you think about that, Jeff, this brings more so the Lord's Prayer into it as well. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. There is, in a way, a diverse, equitable, and inclusion and a racial aspect to that. Because by asking God to bring his kingdom to earth as it is in heaven, we're asking him to drive away all of those divisions and those unnecessary characteristics which divide people. We want people to be together.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So Fleming Rutledge created quite the furor a few weeks ago on Twitter when she made a point, and I'm probably not going to articulate it very well, but she made the point that there's a danger at taking a good word like inclusion and elevating it above the gospel. And the way she argued in the tweet that sometimes we have applied it in a way that sounds like the emphasis is on what we are doing. We are being inclusive,
right?
Which is actually kind of twisting it and making it inaccurate. Where the emphasis on what you're saying is what God is doing,
right? That
we are meant to participate in, as opposed to sort of shrinking back from.
Exactly.
Because in truth, like when we see ourselves in the gospel, we're probably the people that Jesus needs to remind to, like, not just invite our friends to the party, right?
Exactly right.
Like that. So we're not sort of the enlightened inclusive. We're actually the forever not quite inclusive enough.
Exactly right. I completely agree with you on that. Completely agree with you on that. And that is where St. James is right now. It's beginning to realize that even though it is said that it has been inclusive, and it represents that. I mean, it's a very first and inclusive place from appearance. But it's actually finding out that it wasn't actually as inclusive as it should have been. And so, and a lot of this also, from what the young alumni told me, a lot of this had to do with the 2016 election. And so, as you are very well aware, there were strong both sides, Democrat and Republican, and there were some students who really, really bashed the other side for their support of one particular candidate, and the microaggressions and blatant racism from that, unfortunately, it was not stopped by some of the faculty at St. James at the time. And so they were telling me that a lot of that was the background. And to be quite honest with you, even though our student body is very diverse and inclusive, our faculty and our administration is not, unfortunately. Like for instance, I'm the only African American administrator currently on the administration at St. James School. And so a lot of our faculty, unfortunately, they weren't equipped, if you will, to really know how to engage in conversations like that and to and stop what was going on. But we're doing that now. So like for instance, this coming week, we're going to be engaging in conversations, really intense and serious conversations about race among the faculty and how we as a faculty can engage better in conversations about race, how it affects it, and how we can better recognize what is going on in the country and how that affects our student body here. So yeah.
Brandt, we've got about 5 minutes, and I wanted to, because this is something I don't know about, and I wanted to ask you about Black theology. And so I'm going to attend our Sunday school class coming up because I want to know what that means when we say Black theology. Is it a type of liberation theology, or what is Black theology?
Well, just to try to give as concise an answer as I can, theology, of course, means, what we say about God. What is it that we say about God? And so when we talk about theology from a Black standpoint, we are talking about how has the African diaspora seen God? How have they related to God? And not only do you have Black theology, but again, when you have liberation theology and everything like that, it's a particular spin and a particular way of expressing what it is that we believe about God. And when you have all these modifiers in front of the word theology, like Black theology, it is basically that group of people saying, okay, in the majority view of theology, we have been forgotten. And so in order for us to not be forgotten, this is what we as Black people think and say about God that relates to our experience. This is how God has come into our lives, into our experience, and this is how we express our belief in the triune God. So Black theology deals with that. It is the African diasporic way of saying this is who God is for us, and this is how we factor into the larger story. So it is my hope that as you begin this course on Black theology, which I'd be interested to hear more about how the conversations go, that you just keep that in mind. This is how the African American and the African experience has factored into the grander story of God's great kingdom.
That's good.
All right, Brandt, thank you very much for being with us, and hopefully when things return to whatever new normal is in the future for us, you can come join us in person and be a guest preacher and teacher. We'd love to have you in the flesh here at Holy Trinity at some point.
I would love that, Jeff. Thank you very much. Thank you, kindly.
All right.
And I just hate that we couldn't do this live, in which I could have interacted more with some of your parishioners, but hopefully again in person we can do that.
Agreed. Thank you, Brandt. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Guys, thanks for listening, and as we've discussed, make sure to tune into our Sunday school classes going forward as Gail leads us with this really good, firm start to an introduction to Black theology, so we can be enriched by a greater understanding of the African diaspora's experience, knowing and being known by God. Thank y'all.
Brandt, I'll call you soon.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Brandt,